Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we are combining a headless CMS in GraphCMS with Next.js. And they combine really nicely because of Next.js's ability to do SSG, static site generation. I always forget what the SSG stands for, but basically when you deploy your code, it's going to go statically generate all of those pages. So when the user hits the website, it already has it sort of statically output and it just displays HTML. So it's super fast, but in this video we're going to go a little bit further and we're also going to load some additional data client side, and then we're going to add a form so that the user can add new data. And the concept we're working with is sort of historical events. So the event is one model in our GraphCMS backend, and memories are another one. So each event in history can have many memories attached to it. So to get started, this is what we're working with right now. We've got /events and then a slug page. So slug would sort of be filled in with, say, the last time England won the World Cup, or like whatever historical event you're talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the SSG part of it. And this is what I call dynamic SSG. And that's because we're going to call GraphCMS and pull down a list of all the events, and then we're going to dynamically generate a static page for each of those events. And even before we look into code, why don't we go take a look at GraphCMS to just see what the data looks like. So in GraphCMS you define your schema. So here I've defined an event, has a title, a slug, a markdown description, a date, an image, and then it can have multiple memories. And each memory is just who had the memory and what their story is for this memory, and it sort of maps back to an event. So if you look into the content here, I've got two right now. So I've got one that I entered earlier when the Blue Jays won the World Series, 92-93, back-to-back champs. And the one I just filled out here that we're going to do in this video is when England won the World Cup back in 1966. So I added the slug, the markdown description that I just copied from Wikipedia, and then the date it occurred, an image, and I added one memory for this event. So let's get started. Let's go to localhost /events, and what was the slug for this one? It was just that. So we'll pop that in here, and what we should see is just the word events right here. So right now it's not doing anything static at all. It's actually just rendering this component which says the word events. But we're going to add a couple functions and export those that are going to statically generate the paths, so all of the possible pages you can have, and then one that will load the data for each of those pages. So the two I'm talking about are getStaticPaths, which we'll start with, and then getStaticProps that we'll move to after. So getStaticPaths, we define it as export const getStaticPaths, and because I'm working in TypeScript, I have got the type right here. And so this is going to be an async function, and the end goal of this function is basically to return an object that has an array of the paths to generate, and then what to do if a request comes in that we haven't already generated a page for. So for this we're going to say blocking, which will basically dynamically create the page on the fly, cache it so that the next person that comes in and requests that same path can get served up the cache content. Okay, so this is where we're going to be filling in all of the paths, and to do that we need to make a GraphQL call to GraphCMS. So in order to do that, I'm actually going to start by creating a new client, and the client will be this GraphQL client here from GraphQL request. So client is equal to new GraphQL client, and we need to pass in the URL. So my URL I've stored inside of my .env.local that you would set up on Vercel or wherever you're deploying this to. And we're going to copy the next public GraphCMS URL. Just paste that in there. So there's our client. Oops, process.env. Perfect. And then down in here we're going to query our headless CMS with a GraphQL query and get the list of events back. So first we're going to define the query. So const query is equal to GQL, and we're going to say it's a query to find the events. We're going to ask for the events, and for each one, we're just going to get the slug. Because the slug is really all that's needed to then go and generate the data for each of the events that we have in our system. So with that query in place, next thing we need to do is call our client and get some data back. So we'll say const data is await a call to the client that's going to make a request using the query that we just set up. So if we were to console.log this data and we can just see what's coming back, remember this happens on the server. Typically it would happen sort of on deploy as it's building out your static content on the server, but locally it just runs every time you request it. So I'm going to load this, come down here. There's a lot of errors going on because when you use getStaticPaths, you also have to use getStaticProps, which I haven't done yet. But we can see here, here's what we got back. An array of events. Here's the two events, Blue Jays, England World Cup. So what we're going to do is basically instead of an empty array, we're going to access data, events, map them, and then each event. And what we want for each event is basically an object that's going to have some params. And then the params can be whatever we want. So in our case, we're going to have the slug, and that would be event.slug like this. Just clean up this code. Cool. So these paths, what are they used for? They're essentially, it's an array of these param objects, and however many you have, so in our case we have two events, it's going to, for each of those, call the function getStaticProps, passing in these params to that function, which you can then use to query the data for that specific event. So that's what we're going to come and do right here. So export const getStaticProps, proofs, like that. getStaticProps is the type, and it is also asynchronous. But for this one, we are going to receive the params like that are sort of whatever was passed and returned from here. So the goal of this function is basically to return some props, which will be the data that's eventually passed down to our actual component when it's statically rendering and generating. And we should also tell it how long to basically save this cache for. So revalidate, we're going to save it for 60 seconds times, we'll save it for an hour. So 60 seconds times 60 minutes. So after an hour, it's going to basically regenerate on the fly, save that in the cache so that the next person that comes and hits this site will get fresh data. So you can set this as big or as small as you think your data is changing. So we obviously now have to go and make a GraphQL query to GraphCMS. It's going to be very similar to sort of the code we did down here. So what we're going to start off with first of all is we're going to get access to the slug, and it is coming from params.slug. We're just going to give it a type so that it knows what we're working with. And now let's define our query. So our query will be a GraphQL query, and we'll say it's a query to get an event. But this time we're passing in a variable. It's a little bit different than down here. So we need to define our variable. It's going to be a slug, and it's going to be a required string. So then our actual query here will be to get an event. And what we're going to do is we're going to say where the slug is equal to the variable passed in. And now all of the fields we want to ask for on this event. So we want the ID, the slug, the title, oops. We want the date, the description, which is going to be markdown, and we'll talk about how to process that in a second. And then the image, we want its URL specifically. So that's the data we want. Just save this so we get some formatting. And then we're going to go sort of perform and hit our GraphCMS endpoint to perform this query. So for that, we can say const data is equal to await client.request, and we want to request this query, but this time we need to pass in the slug as a variable. So we already put it in a variable here, so you don't have to do /slug because it's the same variable name. So just save this, and then let's add a console.log on the data coming back. So if I load the page now, you'll see that there's no error anymore. We're doing things correctly. Come down here, way to the bottom, and you can see here's all the data coming from GraphCMS. So we got our slug, title, dates, just a string. So if you want to format it differently, you could use something like datefns to parse it and then format it however you want. Here's our markdown, which we're going to use MDX to display this markdown as HTML. And then we got the image down here. So because I'm working in TypeScript, why don't I define a type that will sort of represent the data we're getting back? So we're going to say interface iEvent, and then we're just going to go through the fields and define what they are. So ID is a string, slug's a string, pretty much they're all strings. Date's a string. Next we got image, which has a URL, which is a string. And we have our description, oops, no comma, description, which is a string. And later we'll add on, oops, didn't spell it right, oh boy, cool. Later we'll add on sort of what the markdown looks like that we're going to attach to this event interface as we parse it. But that's good enough for now. So what we can come down here and do now is we can say that what this is going to give us back is going to be an object that's going to have an event, and it will either be an iEvent or null. So why would it ever be null? What happens if I come up here and I change it to like 2021? Well, that's not a record in our database. So what GraphCMS gives us back is just a null record. So we need to take care of sort of what to do if that occurs. So what we can do is we can just say, if there's no event, we are going to return a different object, and this object will just say not found is true. So that will render out the 404 page when you pass a slug that doesn't exist. You could sort of do whatever you want. You could redirect, or it's up to you, but we're going to show the 404 page. Okay. So coming down here, what I want to do is basically start working with the markdown side of things. We're going to create something called source, and source is going to be equal to a call to the serialize function. So serialize, this is coming from Next.MDX remote. MDX, it's basically a way to combine Markdown with React, so you can sort of like mix in your own components as it's outputting the HTML. Normally though, it works off of a local file. We don't have this, our data is coming remotely, but this package allows you to work with MDX within Next.js inside of getStaticProps. And it comes with a serialize function who, when passed sort of the raw markdown, so data.event.description, it's going to give us this thing back, which will be a serialization result. And what we can then do is basically combine that with our raw event data, and that will be the props that we send down to the component. So we're going to come here, we're going to say, okay, the event is everything that was on data event plus the source that we're going to add in. Just like that. So we're now passing this data to our component. So we can come back here and we can say, okay, oops, this is going to receive an event, and what that is going to be is an iEvent record like this. And if we want to, we can add in sort of what the markdown looks like. So we added in source, and it is something called compiled source, which is just a string actually. So if we were to come down here, and we can just start showing it like we would normally do in React, we can say, okay, the h1 is going to be the event.title. Let's say the h2 is the date, and then below, why don't we show the image? So we will say that that is the image.url. Remember to add the alt tag, which will just be we'll say the title. And then below the image, we want to render out the markdown. why don't we just see that it's working first and then we'll get back to this. So this was 1966. Cool. So this is just a random image I found on Flickr. I'm not sure what Tristan da Cunha is, but it does say world champion 1966 here. Okay, let's get down to the markdown side of things. So what we're going to do is use this component here, MDX remote. And we need to basically just pass in everything from event.source, like that. Come back and you can now see it's rendering out my paragraphs. So we're not really taking full advantage of MDX here, because what you can do is you can pass sort of a bunch of other components that can handle like custom tags that you're setting in your markdown. We're not going to cover this here because we've got some pretty simple markdown we're working with, but it does give you the ability to expand later. Now let's just make sure. Cool. So the next thing we are going to work on is basically, okay, we've handled the static side, the SSG side. Now, what if we were to load the memories that I talked about client side? So we'll just do the event static side and then we'll do the rest client side. So we're going to start off by basically calling a component that doesn't yet exist. So we're going to call it memories and we're going to pass down the event ID. So event.id like this. And we won't even save yet because I know it's going to freak out until we go and define this component. So function memories, it's going to receive the event ID, which will be a string like this. And we could just start off by returning a div that says memories like that. So let's come back, make sure it's working okay. So there right at the bottom, hard to see, memories. So our goal here is to sort of client side in the browser after render, go to GraphCMS and fetch the memories so we get them up to date because maybe these are changing more often. Remember that we cached the event itself for an hour. Maybe we wouldn't want to cache the memories that long because it changes more often. So what we're going to do is use a hook called useSWR. So const data is equal to useSWR. And SWR, you typically pass two things. The first is like a key, basically what useSWR uses to differentiate one call from another, but it serves a second purpose, which we'll see in a sec. So we'll pass in the event ID. And then we need a fetcher function. This is the thing that actually goes and does the GraphQL call to GraphCMS and returns our data. So we're going to call this fetch memories. If I could spell, just like this. So this doesn't exist, so it's up to us to go define it. So we're just doing everything in one file here to keep things simple for the video. If I were doing this on a project, I'd probably switch it up into all sorts of different smaller files, but I think that would make things more confusing jumping around. So we'll keep it simple here. Const fetch memories is an async function that's going to receive the event ID as a string, like this. So whatever key you pass in here, or it could be an array of values, you get access to it in your fetcher function. So what we want to do now is define a query. So we'll use GQL again. And this is a query to get the memories. And we need the event ID. We could just call it ID. And it's going to be of type ID. And then we'll ask for the memories. So memories, how do we know which ones to get? We're going to say where the event ID is equal to the variable. And what do we want for each memory? I'm in a habit of asking for the ID even if we're not going to use it, but we're going to get the ID, the name, and the story just like this. So then we'll come down here and we'll use this same GraphQL request client and we'll just return its result. So we'll say client.request and we're going to pass in the query and the variables, and remember it wants the ID, so we're going to just pass ID like this. Save it, And now we can move back down to this component here. So if we wanted to, we could console.log the data just to see what we're doing. Remember, this happens in the browser, so we're going to pop open the developer tools here, go to the console, and you can see here we have an object with the one memory by myself that's saying I wasn't born yet, but if I were alive it would have been really memorable. So what we're going to do here is we need to handle when there's no data. So if no data, we'll just return null. We won't even say loading or anything in this to keep it simple. Data can be null when there's either an error or when it's in a loading state. So this will sort of handle both by just not showing anything. And then we can come down here and we know there's going to be memories to show. So what we can do is we can put this in an H2 and just say memories. And then we can map over the memories, .map. So each memory, and each memory is going to be a block quote, like this. We need to pass a key in. That's why I asked for the ID. Now I remember. So we're going to use the memory's ID as the key here. And then inside the block quote, what we're going to just say is memory.story and then memory.name, whoever wrote it. Save this. Prettier is going to reformat things. Come down, and here we go. So here's the one memory that is in our database so far. And next we're going to go add a form to basically allow the user to add additional new memories. And you can see if I refresh the page, it's so fast you can't even tell. But there is a second that it's not there yet as it's loading from GraphCMS. Okay, so coming back up to our event component, we are going to create another new component called new memory, also giving it the event ID. And then we're going to, why don't we just do this right below? We are going to create this component right here. So we're going to say function new memory is going to receive the event ID, which is a type of string. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return form, and we'll just say form for now. Make sure it's working. It's a thing of beauty. Great. Okay, so we're going to collect two pieces of information: the name and the story. So I'm going to put those into state. So const name is set name is equal to use state like that, and then story is set story is equal to use state like this. And basically where we're going is when the form submits, it's going to post the data to an API route serverless function called memories add. This is going to receive that form data and then make a mutation call to GraphCMS. So why are we doing it in that double step process? Because the ability to call a mutation directly on GraphCMS uses a special API token that has different permissions, and I don't want to expose that to the public, so that's why we're sort of doing this here securely on the server in this add serverless function. So that's where we're going. We're going to come down here and we're going to add our inputs. So type text, value will be name. We could add on change is going to be set name event.target.value. Maybe we add, oops, what did I mess up? There we go. Maybe we add a placeholder that says your name, and we also make it required like that. Come down, your name, you can type, beautiful. So we're going to come and we're going to sort of copy this, but we're just going to make this a text area. And so we don't need this. We would want the story, set story, your story. Beautiful. You can type, works. We need a way to submit this form, so we'll add a button of type submit, add story, like this. So I wouldn't say it's the prettiest form in the world, but it is a form and it can collect data, so that's half the battle. So next, what happens when you submit? What are we going to do? So we're going to create an onSubmit handler that's going to call a function just called onSubmit. Doesn't exist yet, so we need to go create this. So const onSubmit is async. It receives the event from this call here. And then what are we going to do in here? So first thing is prevent default, like this. Next thing, we need to make a post call to our own server, but to this add serverless function. So we're going to call fetch. We're going to await it. And we're going to make the call go to API memories add. And then we need to say, okay, this is going to be a post. The data will be the stringified version of name, story, and event ID. Let me just save this to get formatting. We're going to pass up some headers just so that it gets posted as JSON. So we're going to say here content type is going to be application/JSON. And then sort of when this finishes, maybe what we want to do is set the name back to empty and set the story back to empty as well. But let's not do this yet because I want to just make sure it's working without having to re-enter the data every time. So we're going to come down, we're going to say, okay, Lee Halliday, this was a fantastic match. Cool. So you call this. It's hard to really know what's happening. I mean, we could go to the network tab, call it again. So it is being posted and the server returns with success, but we need to go and actually implement the server. So that's what we're going to head over to and do now. Cool. So here we get a couple things. We get the request details and then the response details. Because we're going to be making a mutation call, let's first just put the data inside of a variable called variables, like this. So it is going to be equal to request.body, which is all the data that was set up. And we're just going to say, hey, trust us, it's going to come up as. And I think we could do this another way too. We could say what the type is right here. So what the type is going to be is basically the event ID as a string, the name as a string, and the story as a string as well. So why don't we console.log this? So remember, this happens on the server. So we post it from the browser, and then we can go and see this console.logging on the server. And these are the exact details I need to be able to pass into a mutation that will go and create a memory in our database. So that's what we have to work on now. First, we're going to define the mutation to go and create a memory. So we'll say const mutation this time is equal to GQL. And we're going to give our mutation a name of add memory. And it's going to take in 3 variables. So we've got the event ID, which is an ID required, the name, which is a string that's required, and then the story, which is also a string that's required. And the actual mutation we call is create memory. Okay, so I mean, maybe this makes more sense to call the same thing. So create memory, we're going to call this, we're going to pass in the data that's needed to create the memory, and we need to pass in the name, which is name, the story, which is the variable of story, and then what we need to do is we need to basically associate it to an event. So we're going to say event, connect to one that's already existing that has an ID of event ID. That's a bit of a mouthful. What we're going to get back, we're just going to get the ID of the memory that was created. So I just wanted to point something out, like how did I know sort of what to work with here? GraphCMS gives you an API playground where you can go and explore how to access your data, but also how to mutate data, how to create one. So in here there's create memory, and you can sort of see it fills in some things, and you could say, okay, you can connect it to an event on the ID. So that's sort of how I learned how to go and call this mutation. Something else to point out is that you need special permissions. So if you go down into settings, permanent auth tokens, I have one down here that I call the mutation token. And these are different from the sort of public content API in that they have sort of higher permission level. So what I gave this token permission to do is read all models, but also to do two things. To be able to create memories, and you also need to give it read and read versions in order to do that. And because I'm connecting it to an event, I needed the ability to update an event as well. So this special token I'm storing down here inside of .env.local. I didn't put next public because I don't want this to be public. It's a sensitive token. And we're going to use that and attach it to the request going up to GraphCMS. So we're almost done. We're going to say client is equal to new GraphQL client. We need to first give it the URL. So that was next public GraphCMS URL, I think. Yep. And you can also pass in different things like headers. So we're going to pass up the authorization header, which has bearer, and then we're going to embed in that mutation token that I just mentioned. So that's the client. We are going to await it to call and perform this mutation. So we're going to say await client.request. Here's the mutation, and then the variables are just actually the variables that I already put into a variable called variables, very confusing, up here. And then it just returns success true. So if we wanted to, we could put this in data, and then we could console.log sort of what it gives us back. So why don't we go and do that? We can see here that the responsive create memory mutation was the new memory ID. So if we go into our content memories, what you'll see is there's actually a new memory here that's been created with a draft status. So by default, it won't show me this memory because it's only showing published memories. So that gives sort of us some control over which memories are actually shown to our users, some publishing control to maybe keep an eye on what people are submitting as their memories here. So we can just say, yep, this one looks good. We'll swap the name out because I already have one as Lee Halliday. We'll just say Bob, I don't know, Smitters. We're going to publish this, and now it should be live. So coming back here, you can actually see right away it's showing this memory, and that's because of SWR. SWR has a setting that when the browser tab gets focus again, it recalls the query. So when I sort of left and came back, it requeried the memories, and now that it's published, it's showing up. And the last step is basically to just clean up our code. Let's get rid of sort of these variables we don't need. And then when somebody does that, we would blank out the form again. So we'll come here, we'll just refresh, and we'll try to add a memory. So we'll say this is Peter. I was having the time of my life. Boom. Add the story. Calls our API within Next.js, which calls the mutation on GraphCMS. Come here, click on memory. We have this new one. We can then publish. Come back here, boom, I was having the time of my life from Peter. So I hope you could see the power of using a headless CMS like GraphCMS, combining it with Next.js, the ability to do SSG or client-side queries and serverless functions, and sort of merge that all together to create a pretty complete experience without the need of building all of this out as your own backend with a database and mutations and resolvers and all of that stuff. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll share the finished code up and also the starter code if you want to set up your own GraphCMS account and try and follow along with me. As one bonus, if you go to the home page, you're actually going to see a list of the events here that link you over to them. So I had another one that I did before for the Blue Jays winning the World Series. And the way that works is slightly different in that I did it using getStaticProps, which is dynamically called every single time you request the page. So there's no sort of caching going on here, but it's doing the same sort of thing. It's calling the GraphQL endpoint, getting a list of events, passing them into the component, and then just rendering them out in a list. So this is here if you want to look at another example of how to connect to GraphCMS. All right, peace. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.